Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am Brahima Kulibali, the Vice President of the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this report launch event on the opportunities and challenges of emerging technologies. Technological change led by digital technologies and artificial intelligence is a defining feature of our time. Transformative new technologies are reshaping markets, business models, and the nature of work. But as they create new opportunities, they also pose new challenges, not least of which is rising economic inequality, particularly in the advanced economies. Rising inequality has been stoking social discontent and political ferment, and it has emerged as an important topic of political debate and a major public policy concern. There are important questions that must be addressed. In what ways are the new technologies altering growth, employment, and the distributional dynamics? How are they affecting inequality within economies and prospects for economic convergence between economies? How can the promise of digital transformation be translated into better, more inclusive outcomes for economic growth and development? Or what are the implications for public policy? And importantly, what new thinking and adaptations are needed to make institutions and policies better fit for the digital era at the national and global levels? The report we're launching today, entitled An Inclusive Future, Technology, New Dynamics, and Policy Challenges, addresses these questions. It's available on the Brookings website, and it is part of a larger and ongoing Brookings Global Forum on Democracy and Technology project, which seeks to promote ideas and policies, to manage technological change, to build inclusive prosperity and strengthen democratic societies. Harnessing technological change to promote inclusive growth and development is a key part of our research agenda within the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. An important message of the report is that large and persistent increases in inequality within economies are not an inevitable consequence of technological change. Much depends on public policy response. A related message is that in capturing the full promise of today's technological transformation, economic growth and inclusion are not competing, but complementary objectives. Public policy must enable broader participation of firms and workers, including smaller firms and wider segments of the workforce, in the opportunities created by new technologies. In emerging economies, technological change will disrupt traditional pathways to growth and development, but it also offers new opportunities for economies that successfully recalibrate their growth model to the new technological paradigm. We are very fortunate to have with us today the report's authors to discuss these issues. I would like to thank David Otter, Kashuk Basu, and Daniel Roderick, who contributed important papers to the report, and for participating in the launch event. They are all lead thinkers in their fields. David and Daniel, who are joining us live, welcome. And Kashuk, unfortunately, could not join us live because of an unavoidable last-minute conflict, but he has sent us a pre-recorded presentation. I'm also delighted to welcome Laura Tyson, another distinguished economist and leading thinker and public policy figure, as a discussant to the report. Finally, I would like to thank my Brookings colleague, Zia Qureshi, who co-authored and edited the report. And I'm sure we're in for a very stimulating conversation. I will now turn it over to Zia, who will moderate the discussion. Zia, over to you.
Thank you, Kul. Thank you for your welcome and for your thoughtful opening remarks that provide the context and frame our discussion very well. Rapid technological change led by digital technologies and the now unfolding innovations in artificial intelligence is indeed a big story of our time. The new technologies hold great promise to boost economic prosperity. But as they transform business and work, they have also highlighted and can deepen economic and social fault lines across advanced and developing economies. One important fault line is economic inequality, which has risen in many countries, including and sharply here in the United States. A key element of the forward public policy agenda in countries today is to better harness the potential of technological transformation to boost productivity and growth, create good jobs, and produce broad-based improvements in economic prosperity. The title of the report we are presenting and discussing today poses a question. This is the report. And the question is, can an inclusive future be envisioned in the digital era? The answer to that question is a yes, but a conditional yes. Public policy must play its part to put technology to work for broader groups of firms and workers and better meet the needs of and interests of economies and societies. Public policy has been behind the curve in responding to the profound technology-driven shifts that are taking place in the functioning of markets and economies. In important areas of policy, the new economic dynamics of the digital era call for new thinking and a revamp of existing policies. As Gould mentioned, combating inequality as technology drives change is not only a distributional issue, it is also a growth issue to promote more inclusive growth. The paths to achieving stronger economic growth and more inclusive economic growth from the new technologies are closely interlinked. So to discuss these issues, we are privileged to have an excellent group of speakers, all of whom are well recognized for their work. So I can be brief with their introductions. First, the three authors who contributed papers to the report. David Autor is Ford Foundation Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He also co-directs the Labor Studies Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Kaushik Basu is Professor of Economics and C. Marks Professor of International Studies at Cornell University, and a former chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank, and a former chief economic advisor to the government of India. Danny Roderick is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is also the current president of the International Economic Association. Our esteemed discussant, Laura Tyson, is Distinguished Professor of the Graduate School and Professor Emeritus at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. She's a former chair of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors and director of the National Economic Council. The event page at the Brookings website provides links to the very impressive resumes of our speakers. I would like to thank also all those who are tuning in to this discussion. If you wish to submit questions during the discussion, you can do so via email to events@brookings.edu or via Twitter using the hashtag #InclusiveFuture. And thank you to those who have already submitted questions beforehand. So we will proceed as follows. We will first have presentations about 10 minutes each by the authors of the report, David, Kaushik, and Denny, on the main points and policy messages of their papers. This will be followed by discussion comments from Laura, again for about 10 minutes. The authors, that is Danny and David, who are with us live, will then have the opportunity briefly to respond to discussion comments. And we will have an interactive discussion, including taking up questions from our viewers. So let's start with David Orter. David's paper focuses on the labor market, a key transmission mechanism for how technology impacts growth, employment, and distributional dynamics. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. I assume you can hear me okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel and this report where we were able to share our thoughts. And I'm going to speak today about the labor market's impacts of technological change and how economists have gone from kind of unbridled enthusiasm to qualified optimism to what I would call vast uncertainty and where that leaves us. So it's important to start out by noticing that citizens and experts are pessimistic about the societal impacts of digital technology. Even academic economists, according to the Chicago Markets poll. So, for example, here's a Pew Research from 2018, and asking if robots and computers were able to do much of the work currently being done by humans, what would happen? Most citizens think the inequality between rich and poor would be much worse than it is today, 3/4 of Americans. Less than half in most countries think that the economy would be more efficient, including only 43% of Americans. And only a quarter of people think there would be new, better paying jobs in the US. So it's important to notice that the US, which is usually thought of as a beacon of technological optimism, is rather on the pessimistic side here as well. So what is the role of technology in determining wages and shaping wage inequality, and why the growing pessimism, or tinged with what Shoshana Zuboff would call inevitabilism, the view that our fate will befall us. It's only a matter of accepting it. So there are really four recent ways of understanding that I'm going to quickly walk through. One is the education race model, in which technology raises all boats, although some more than others. The second is the task polarization model, where some boats are rising, others are submerging. The third is what I'll call the automation reinstatement race, that all boats could sink, although not necessarily. And then the fourth is the AI intelligence uncertainty, which is, do we even need boats anymore? Which leaves so many open questions. So let me just walk through those and try to highlight, I think, how this intellectual journey that scholars have been on, and hopefully why it leads to where it does. So the competitive wage setting is the sort of intellectual foundation for all of these models. Wages depend primarily on the value workers produce of their labor, that is, their productivity. Their productivity depends on their capabilities, the tasks they can accomplish through their skills, and their scarcity. If fewer workers are able to perform a needed task, they'll earn higher wages. There are fewer available. Technological change affects wages by changing the scarcity of skills. It may complement labor in certain tasks, raising wages. It may substitute for labor in given tasks, lowering wages. It may directly automate, meaning replace labor with capital, or it may create demand for novel tasks and expertise, reinstating labor. So how do we, to begin the sort of optimistic side of the talk, the education race model has kind of framed a lot of academic understanding of technological progress over the last 50 years. He starts with a short informal article by the Dutch economist and Nobel laureate Jan Tinbergen, who makes this analogy of an education race that says modern economies face an ongoing race where technological change is forever propelling the demand for skill outward, and education must just push the supply curve outward to keep pace. If it doesn't keep pace, inequality rises. If it does keep pace, inequality holds constant. If it accelerates, inequality falls. So you can think of this as a Red Queen model. It takes all the running you can do just to keep in the same place. Countries must constantly raise educational attainment. There is no finite quantity of skill. You just have to keep educating people more and more as generations pass. And this is formalized and empirically verified in some very well-known papers and books. And just to show you how successful this model is, this shows you the college high school wage premium in the United States for 103 years of data. And the dashed line is what we actually see. This is the proportional difference between college and non-college wages, which fluctuates between 60% and 30%, then up to 70%. And the solid line is what's predicted by this very simple model. And except for a period around the Second World War, referred to as the Great Compression, it really fits the data remarkably well. So it explains a lot with little. You can organize a century of data with this. And it reveals an important driver of inequality that's usually not discussed, which is it's not necessarily that demand for skills has accelerated, but that the supply growth has decelerated, that after the 1970s in most industrial countries, the growth rate of college-educated workers slowed down, especially associated with the Vietnam War. It has some limitations. Taken too literally, it implies that technological progress is an autonomous force that intrinsically makes highly educated workers more productive. It doesn't explain why that's true or whether that's always true. It sort of assumes that's true. And as conventionally applied, it implies that technology only augments the productivity of skill groups. It may raise inequality, but never lowers anybody's wages. And that's why one can be very optimistic in that framework, right? Because that's all good, unless you're worried about inequality per se. If all boats are rising, you should be happy about that. However, the data show us that not all boats are rising. A key contributor to the rising college high school wage differential is the falling real wages of non-college workers. That's a really important and puzzling fact. Now, this can be interpreted within the education race model, but you have to change the model a lot to do it, not in the way that Jan Tinbergen thought about it. So it's important to kind of delve deeper, which I'll do next, into why technology, if technology is involved, might cause wages of some skill groups to fall. But let me just summarize this model. The education race model for high educated workers, we see strong complementarity, wages will rise. There is no medium educated workers in this model, so let's leave them out. Low educated workers are only weakly complemented, so their wages rise, but only a little bit. So in general, this model says that all else equal, technological advances cause inequality to rise unless supply grows with it. So now let me dig a little deeper. Why does computerization in particular appear to complement highly educated workers? Where is that coming from? So a series of some work that I've done starts by conceptualizing the process of accomplishing a job as performing a series of tasks, and then asks, well, which tasks will be carried out by machines and which by workers? And finally, consider how computerization or digitalization might change this picture. So the key observation in this kind of way of thinking about it is what has come to be known as Polanyi's paradox, after the philosopher Michael Polanyi. He says, we know more than we can tell. Many of the things that we do without much effort are actually really hard to automate because we don't know the rules for doing them. So I can tell you how to, calculate, file, perform repetitive actions, and organize information, but I can't tell you how to make a persuasive argument, how to lead a group of people, nor can I tell you actually how to vacuum a room, because that requires all kinds of sightedness and dexterity and so on. And so this explains why some tasks are readily computerized, because the ones that follow well understood rules and procedures can often be turned into computer code and executed by machines. And we see that phenomenon occurring across industrialized world. This is just for the US, and sort of shows this barbell of what's called occupational polarization. On the one hand, we have growth of high skill, high wage, analytic, technical, and managerial tasks. These things are complemented by computers. In the middle, we see a lot of production, office administrative, and sales work being automated away. These follow well understood rules and procedures, what people call routine codifiable tasks, and they can be codified, done by machines. And then what hangs around is a lot of services that require dexterity and flexibility: health and personal services, cleaning and protective services, operative and labor jobs. So you get this kind of barbell. And this barbell is found throughout the industrialized world, not in developing world, let me just emphasize, but in industrialized countries. Now, what are the wage implications? Well, it's actually kind of complicated, because when people are pushed out of the middle, they tend to move downward, not upward. And so the implications for inequality are very different from the barbell shape. But some recent progress has been made on this in a paper by Asamoah and Restrepo, and they argue that workers who were accomplishing routine tasks, decades ago, have been pushed downward, and so we see this falling wages of workers who formerly worked in industries that have automated their routine intensive activities. So just to summarize, this model gives you strong complementarity with high skill work, direct substitution of middle skill work, no immediate impact on the lowest skill work, but we see employment polarization and rising wage inequality. I'm just going to actually close my window because I think you hear the lawnmowers going on my street. Hopefully that helped a bit. Okay. So let me add a third wrinkle to this, which is I've talked about automation, but there's another force as well. What about new work? In its basic form, these models just basically have a finite set of activities, and some of them are automated and some are still done by people. No tasks are added or subtracted, only the, who does what. But you kind of need some notion of new tasks, new things being added. Why? Well, one kind of casual empiricism. We know that work evolves, that there's demands for new skills and expertise previously unimagined: drone pilots, artificial intelligence programmers, pediatric vascular surgeons, vegan chefs, executive coaches. The other, if the task domain were really static, automation would inexorably crowd people into a shrinking set of activities. But that's not our perception, right? The world has actually gotten more complicated and creative, not narrower and narrower, right? At least that's my perception. So Jeff Lynn, in a 2011 paper, shows you how we can find representative evidence on the appearance of new work. He offers a methodology for systematically capturing new work hiding in plain sight using Census Bureau's historical documents. And in recent work with co-authors and I have expanded on this. And then Asimoglu and Restrepo, another paper, add this notion back into the task model. And they say, well, you can think of automation as the process of when machines take over labor tasks, and reinstatement as the process when new labor-using tasks are invented that have to be done by people initially. So in recent work with Carolyn Chin, Anna Solomons, and Brian Segmiller, we try to implement this over a long period of time. And we show that about 60% of all work today, or in 2018, is in tasks that had not yet been invented in 1940. So a lot of new work, a lot of current work is new work, new in the last 80 years, new in the last century. You might say, well, what do you mean by new work? Give me an example. Well, glad you asked. So here are some examples added over various decades. So, for example, in 1940, the automated welding machine operator, or a textile chemist, or control of remotely piloted vehicles, an AI specialist, a pediatric vascular surgeon. Those are one set of jobs. Now you might think, oh, I see. So new work is about people who use new technology, or sell it, or fix it, or install it, design it, etc. However, many new jobs are actually services that don't have an obvious technological element, but more reflect changing taste, changing wealth, changing demographics, like a beautician, a mental health counselor, a conference planner, a chat room monitor, a drama therapist, or a sommelier. And now you might say, okay, well, sommeliers have been around for a long time, but there weren't enough in the United States to sort of be captured by the census. So only in 2010 the sommeliers really hit the big time here. So why does this occur? Why is new work created? So in this work with Chin and Solomon Segmiller, we distinguish between automation innovations, things that erode employment, and what we call augmentation innovations, things that enhance the value of services created by people and often demand new expertise and knowledge. And those have countervailing effects on employment. We show on the left side that things that are augmented tend to grow. These are occupations. Things that are automated tend to shrink, and these often occur in the same place. Some occupations are subject to both simultaneously. So both of these forces are present, both automation and what you might call reinstatement. It's also important to emphasize that it's not just technology. Plain old demand shifts create new work. When demand grows, you have new expertise being formed. New work is different from more work. If you make a big investment, for example, in electrification of the grid, you're not just going to get more workers, you're going to get workers with new specialties, like, for example, solar electricians or solar plumbers. Those are people who just do those tasks on solar installation sites. Those are new titles captured by the Census Bureau. Okay, so let me skip the table in the interest of time. So let me now get to the fourth and final section, the era of AI uncertainty. So when it comes to AI, does the task framework still fit, or should it just quit? Well, it has two conceptual pieces. The first is the notion of tasks as units of work to be accomplished by workers or machines. This is still, I think, a useful idea. The second is a theory of which tasks can be readily computerized, again, based on Polanyi's paradox, these things that follow well-understood rules and procedures. AI blows that away, right? It overcomes the constraint that computers can accomplish only explicitly understood routine tasks, because, of course, AI infers tacit relationships using statistical associations, supervised learning, unsupervised learning. So computers can figure things out without explicit rules using AI. So that raises a really leaves a wide open question. Well, what will AI do? What will people do? What is the area of comparative advantage of machines and people in this new era? And I don't think we know the answer. We're only beginning to get evidence on this. I will say one thing I'm very confident of is AI will perform a lot more expert managerial and professional decision-making tasks that we used to think of as highly skilled. So this is already occurring in finance and investing, inventory management, credit issuance, fraud detection, and design. Some expert and semi-expert tasks will become technologically equivalent to, quote, routine tasks. They'll be cheaper and faster and more reliably done by machines, even though we think of them as having to requiring this kind of knowledge, judgment, intuition, and so on. Now there's a counter argument. It says, well, look, AI is context blind. It can't reason holistically. It can't do these things. This argument might be convincing if people were actually consistent, analytical, and reliable at doing these types of tasks. But in fact, they're not. People are highly inconsistent. They can't even follow their own rules. So the notion that a machine that's also somewhat inconsistent or opaque can't do it is not that compelling to me. Simultaneously, I want to emphasize human capacities are underrated. People do extraordinary things all the time effortlessly. They apply common sense to tease apart intractable problems. They generalize inferences from small data. Generalizing from small data is actually harder than generalizing from big data. They use abductive reasoning to form plausible interpretations from a spare set of observations. So in many ways, we don't even fully appreciate how much tacit knowledge we possess. So people will continue to have comparative advantage in creativity, judgment, hypothesis formation, contextual thinking, causal analysis, communication, emotional intelligence. There's going to be a lot of work to do, but it's going to be different. It's going to be different. Let me actually point out an irony I can't resist. What I call the AI irony. Artificial intelligence is opaque to humans. Its layers, statistical associations are encoded in countless nodes. There's no human interpretable window into the decision-making process that most AI engages in. This is a big problem known to AI researchers. Due to this opacity, Polanyi's paradox survives with a twist. Prior to AI, people struggled to give computers tacit knowledge needed performing non-routine tasks. In the AI era, computers can actually readily acquire tacit knowledge, but they cannot, in almost all cases, communicate that knowledge explicitly to people. So I call this Polanyi's revenge. Computers now know more than they can tell us. Okay, so let me conclude with policies and possibilities. So I'm gonna give the policies short shrift, but I hope we'll have time to talk about them in later. So really, in a recent book with Elizabeth Reynolds and David Mindell that we wrote for the MIT Task Force on the Work for the Future, we talked about three bodies of policy to deal with these challenges and take advantage of them. One is, of course, education and training. That's a given, it's an evergreen, but it's wholly insufficient. A second is to revitalize the governmental and non-governmental and private sector institutions that shape job quality. Job quality should not just be left to the market. I know that is a point that Danny has made in many contexts and I've found very influential. Labor standards, federal minimum wages, improving the unemployment insurance system, removing health insurance, and directly deciding what types of jobs we want to create. The third, of course, is shaping innovation to speed productivity growth and complement the skills of the labor force. Innovation is not an autonomous force. It's something that we invest in, that we shape through incentives, and we put public dollars into. So let me just conclude with possibilities. One uncertainty, and one admonition. And this relates back to this negativism, this pessimism or inevitablism that we see. I think the uncertainty is that AI has vastly extended the frontier of technological possibilities. Our clarity about the future should be smaller than it was 10 years ago, not greater. I think we knew the path 10 years ago which technology was going. Now we really don't. The certainty is that this technology will expand the set of desirable possibilities that are within reach to deal with provision of healthcare, with education, with global warming. There are things we will be able to do using technology that would be otherwise much harder, but we could easily blow it. Right? It doesn't mean we will use it for that. It just means that we could. We could also use it for surveillance. We could use it for hacking, right? We could use it for, filtering all the contents of the world information to make sure only what the government or advertisers want us to see is what we see. The admonition is that the future really isn't a fate to be divined. It's something we're actively creating as we go. So we should ask not what we want ask not what AI will accomplish, but what we want it to accomplish. And we should invest and shape to make sure that's what it's used for. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I apologize that I'm
David.
yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing and just as soon as I figure out how to do that. If not, someone, great.
Great. Thank you, David, for that excellent exposition of technology's impact on labor market dynamics, jobs and wages. We next turn to Kaushik Basu, who recorded his presentation as he could not be with us today live. Kaushik's paper has a broad sweep covering important structural shifts that are taking place, including in product markets that are seeing a shift toward monopolistic structures dominated by tech giants. And the paper makes the case for a more radical overhaul of policies and points to new challenges for the discipline of economics. So can we show Kaushik's recorded presentation, please?
Good morning, good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to participate in this conference. I should begin by thanking Zia Qureshi for the original invitation to me to contribute a paper to this important and urgent collection. I'm also grateful for the comments I received later from Zia himself, Janina Broker, Brookings Institution, and several others while I was working on this paper. The paper is about technological advance and globalization, the pitfalls and the opportunities. I have to say I'm optimistic that out of this very dangerous time, good things will come. Or maybe to put it more correctly, I try to be optimistic that out of this dangerous moment, good things will come. But it is a very, very dangerous time for the world. Let me explain a little bit. There are other papers by David Otter, by Danny Roderick, which touch on different aspects of it. I will, of course, encroach on some common topics, but also try to stay away from what I know they are contributing in a big way. A part of the problem is coming from the rise of digital technology, technological advance. This has been the case throughout history. Episodes, which are very occasional episodes, when there is rapid change in technology, that at one level is a blessing because it expands our production possibility frontier. What is possible is now bigger because we've got new technology. But by virtue of the new technology, opens up new challenges, which if we don't manage to take those challenges on right, we could actually have a devastating effect on our economy. This could be the dinosaur moment for the human economy. On the other hand, if we manage to take on the challenge, we come out of it better off. The challenge is deep, and I will explain that in a moment, but let me go back to a little bit of history where something similar happened. This is the Industrial Revolution. Roughly from 1750 to 1850, 1860, roughly 100 years, we saw the most rapid advance in technology. There was labor-saving technology coming, the demand for labor is falling, and also much more basic skills could be put to use. Children could use their labor to produce things because of new technology. This period, which now in retrospect was a period that helped humanity, we have data from Angus Madison, that growth, the world growth, up to 1820, from 1500 to 1820, world growth was roughly 0.32% per annum. After the end of the Industrial Revolution from 1870 onwards, if you look at another 100, 150 years, growth rate has gone up, average growth from 0.32 to 2.12, 7 times faster the growth rate. So we came out of it fine. In fact, if we come out of the current situation fine, the current growth rate of 3% per annum roughly for the world could become 21% per annum, which will be another form of transformed world. What happened during the Industrial Revolution is important for us to remind ourselves. There was radical policy change. There were policies coming in which was not tweaking what we were doing earlier, but very, very different kinds. For instance, restrictions on labor, supporting workers in different ways, which was unheard of till then. starting from Sir Robert Peel's Act of 1802, there were all kinds of labor supporting legislation that was being brought in. Child labor was being stopped, which was, or initially there were restrictions placed on child labor and eventually stopped, which was then considered a shocking intervention. Income tax, which is normal for us today, was brought in 1842, which was a shocking innovation and radical policy at that time. So policy changes quite dramatic. Along with that, we have to remember economics, political economy progressed in leaps and bounds and in fundamental ways from over roughly the same 100 years. 1776 is Adam Smith's seminal work. Say 1874 is Leon Walras's seminal work. In between, we have Augustine Cournot, we have David Ricardo, we have Karl Marx, we have John Stuart Mill, transforming the way we view and understand the economy. So it's policies and intellectual innovation which saved the world, and we came out of it better off. Come to today's time. The technological advance this time is of a different kind. And that is what is creating a challenge, because we can't go back to the old lessons we had learned. Of the different kind of changes that are taking place, I'm going over this a bit hurriedly because I know time is restricted and my paper is there. You can read it and engage later on. Important change that is happening this time, one of them is labor-saving technology has always been there. Advances usually advance in labor-saving technology, and we are seeing the demand for labor falling. David Otter has done important work on that. Several other people have done work. You can see the demand for labor falling. But along with that, there is something else happening, which is new this time, labor linking technology. So thanks to the advance of digital technology, what we can do today is not just save on labor by switching over to machines, but save on labor in a rich country by linking up through digital routes with labor in a faraway country, sitting in Bangalore or Manila or Cape Town and working for New York or London or Berlin. Workers in different places getting linked. And all this is causing strain, political strain, which is a big part of it. There is another change that is taking place, which is quite dramatic and asks us, analysts, to get back to the drafting board and do some deep fundamental research. Normal economics is important, like normal science, but we have to take time away a little bit to look at the fundamental assumptions beneath our subject, so tucked away in the woodwork that very often economists forget that these assumptions are there. Look at one example I will give you. In a lot of the early work from Adam Smith to Walras, the market maker, the agent that brings the buyers and the sellers together, is usually an invisible hand. It's the invisible hand of the market. Lots of people want to sell, lots of people want to buy. For Adam Smith, it's through the invisible hand, not quite an agent that people are managing to transact. For Walras, it is an auctioneer, an imaginary auctioneer that brings the buyers and the sellers together. But look at what's happened with our new technology today. The invisible hand has suddenly become a very visible player. The imaginary auctioneer is today a very, very visible character. The digital platform is the invisible hand in a very visible form, or the imaginary auctioneer in a very visible form. So suddenly this imaginary character has become a real element of the market. And there's another thing, that this player, the digital platform, is not only has come into existence, it's a profit-making body. We had never imagined that the invisible hand would itself become a profit-making, massive, mega, almost a monopolistic agent, bringing different players together. That is what's happening through Amazon, through Uber, through Airbnb. These digital platforms are doing that. Transforming the way we do economics, because we have to think of the buyers and the sellers as profit makers, and we have to think of the digital platform as a profit maker, creating a new market structure. Not surprisingly, first of all, there is a big theoretical agenda open over here, and I don't even know, because it's sufficiently big that we have to put our minds together and we will discover new ways of structuring, analyzing, setting up the axiomatic description of our economy and doing it. But this is also pushing us in policy directions which are quite novel. First of all, I have one difference with the whole class of writers, that labor, in the end, the demand for labor could go down and there is nothing much you can do about it. For instance, if there is a robotic invention whereby the robot begins to do everything that menial labor does, and it can also create new forms of labor, new robots, then at one level, anything which is work, which is painful work, we don't have to do anymore. Robots have taken over. We can sit back, go to the opera, listen to music, create art, write philosophy, whatever we enjoy doing, we can spend our time on that. To me, that in itself is not a bad thing at all, but it would be a bad thing under the current legal regulatory structure where the income of the workers will vanish and it'll all go into the pockets of the people who own the robots and the machines and the patents and the intellectual property. If we had a better distribution of income, then the fact that we all sit back and do leisure activities and these robots are running around and doing our work would not be a tragedy at all. It would be, in fact, the kind of utopia that many early thinkers like Thomas More and others have written about and thought about. So what do? Policy, yes, we have to use some of the standard policies. Well, there are people who are writing that we are not using our antitrust policy correctly. These platforms are mega players sucking in the profit and you need to do something. I'm grateful that there's a slew of recent writers stressing that our antitrust policy, especially in the United States, starting from the Sherman Act in 1890, has been over-focused on the consumer and concern about the consumer, whereas we need to be concerned about the laborers who are being exploited, about small retail firms who are being exploited by these platforms. So the shift, there has to be a shift in the focus of antitrust. But still, you will not be able to solve it by that route, simply because there are such big economies of scale that you can't cut up these platforms into 1,000 platforms and the whole advantage is gone. So what do? And I have two, again, I should say, very, very early, hesitating suggestions, but which I feel we have to put on the table and begin to think. One is, mega profits by these platforms or big corporations in itself would not be a problem if this mega profit was going into millions and billions of pockets. One way to do that is to have dispersed shareholding laws, that these big corporations, that these digital platforms cannot be owned primarily by 20 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. There will have to be dispersed shareholding so that the big profits go into a big number of pockets, in which case it would not worry us so much. Profit sharing as a rule, something that Marty Weitzman wrote about a long time ago, is something that we have to turn to, because profit motive is important. I'm not for a moment saying that you stop the profit motive. The profit motive has to be there, but it has to be a dispersed holding so that the profit is going into many pockets. One more suggestion, which sounds radical at this point of time, but we have to think about. Certain kinds of businesses, we realized a long time ago, cannot be left to the private sector. The best example of this is the central bank. The Bank of England, set up in 1694, was owned by shareholders. I forget now, 1,200 or certain number of shareholders making profits. The Indian Reserve Bank of India was a private entity making profits. At some point of time, it's realized that when a business is a business which is virtually an entry ticket, the money creating authority is basically giving an entry ticket for all agents, that if you want to survive in the modern economy, you have to buy my product, namely money. It was realized that such a big gatekeeper cannot be a private player. Then it's one individual or a small group that controls the whole economy. And the central banks were one after another turned away from making a profit-making body to a non-profit. Different kinds of structures they take, but it's a non-profit. Bank of England is non-profit. Reserve Bank of India is non-profit. Virtually all central banks are non-profit. You can't make profits through that. I feel we've reached a time where for some of the biggest platforms, which are virtually an entry ticket for a buyer or a seller to survive in the modern economy, you have to think of eventually of one or two of these to be turned into non-profits, maybe controlled by similar rules as we do for the central bank. You don't want the state to take full control of that, but there has to be a certain autonomy with a non-profit structure. These are, I know, thinking outside of the box, but I'm not saying that this is the specific thing you have to think about, but we are at a juncture in society where we have to open up these questions that we look away from in normal times, because this is a make it or break it moment for humanity. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. All of you, best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaushik. There are some provocative insights and ideas here that we will come back to in our discussion. Next, Denny Roderick's paper addresses the implications of technological change for global economic convergence. While inequality within countries has been rising in recent decades, inequality between countries has been falling, thanks to the rise of faster growing developing economies that have been narrowing the income gap with advanced economies. But as Denny analyzes in his paper, technological change is posing new challenges for global economic convergence. Denny?
Thank you, Zia, and thanks to Brookings for putting this panel together and the individual contributions. I've learned a lot from reading David's and Kaushik's pieces. I will, let me see if I can get the my presentation up. I hope you can see my presentation. I want to basically just to give away my punchline at the outset. I have two main conclusions that I want to develop. One is that the present technological trends have essentially made it very difficult for repeating the kind of growth miracle exercises that we've seen most noticeably in East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, China. Very rapid economic growth and convergence, very rapid poverty reduction. I think the possibilities of export-oriented industrialization that enabled such growth miracles have really waned, and I think the main conclusion number one is that it's going to be very difficult to have sustained very rapid growth of the type that we've seen before. Conclusion number two is that that even if we set our targets on reasonable, moderate rates of growth that will achieve a steady, if rather slower convergence with incomes in the rich world, that achieving that is going to require a significantly different economic strategy in low and middle income countries. And that sort of those policy implications are the ones that I want to end with, and I'll return to that at the end and say a little bit more about that. But to start with, we are coming out of a period when, in fact, there was a significant global convergence in incomes. Prior to the pandemic, for a period of 2 or 3 decades, in fact, lower income countries were experiencing faster growth than rich countries. It was a relatively rare thing for the world economy since the great divergence that started following the Industrial Revolution. And this period of convergence was actually quite widespread, including very low income countries. It wasn't just an East Asian phenomenon. We sort of all sort of expectations are now that after the pandemic, we're going back to a divergence period. There's a lot of different reasons for that, a lot of problems having to do with not just on the human capital front, on the public debt front. But I think even if you look at the trends before the pandemic, it was quite clear that there was something quite unsustainable in the economic growth experience of the developing countries in the last 2 or 3 decades, and that those special circumstances were already disappearing. The one key thing that I want to draw your attention to in that period of recent convergence was that it really was not, for most countries, it was not based on what has been the most reliable and most potent form of economic convergence the world has ever seen, which is industrialization. And I think it's important to understand why industrialization has been such a potent force for driving rapid economic growth. And I think there are 3 reasons why manufacturing historically has been special. One is that manufacturing is an area where, in fact, it has been relatively easy for lagging countries to absorb new technologies. So in the language of growth economics, manufacturing is the one sector of the economy where we have observed unconditional convergence, or as far back as we can create data sets to look at. So there's a technological dynamism which is relatively easy to absorb. That's number one. The second aspect is on the supply side, that manufacturing has typically required a relatively low-skilled labor, which of course poor countries have plenty of. So on the supply side, expanding manufacturing typically has not run into supply side constraints. You can simply bring more people from the farm. And on the demand side, because manufacturing is mostly tradable, you can actually export manufacturing. So there are not demand side constraints to scaling up and expanding manufacturing either. So historically, the countries that have grown very rapidly have done so by specializing in a sequence of increasingly more sophisticated manufacturing sectors without relying on domestic demand, but relying on global demand, and therefore sort of this feasibility of scaling up. So the absence of constraints on the demand side, the absence of constraints on the supply side, and this technological dynamism is really what makes this particular manufacturing has been historically special. Now, of course, of those 3 conditions, the one that is really no longer operative is really the fact that the technological change has made manufacturing a much less low-educated, low-skill abundant sector in the economy. And I think we've already been seeing this, and there's been a trend of premature deindustrialization happening in the developing world. That developing low-income countries are not reaching levels of manufacturing employment that was characteristic of countries that had industrialized before them. And these peaks in manufacturing are taking place at much lower levels of income. There are today virtually no developing countries that have managed to exceed or even come close to 20% of employment in manufacturing. And even if we look at sort of relative successes, they're very blemished cases. In low-income Africa, Ethiopia is the only country that has actually experienced significant industrialization. But if you look closer at what's been happening there, it's highly informal, 90% of employment, and the growing part of employment is in the informal part, which does not share this technological dynamism. I'll show you a picture in a second. Bangladesh, of course, has been even more successful than Ethiopia, but remains highly narrowly specialized in ready-made garments, with very few backward linkages. And informalization of manufacturing is a big problem there too. Now, when you look at sort of the kinds of remedies that are offered for cases of these, industrialization, even in those successful cases that are hitting these bottlenecks, the policy remedy is, well, you need to move up the quality chain. You need to move up, sort of, invest in skills and digitalization, but of course, the whole issue is that what historically has has manufacturing that's contributed to these low-income countries is precisely the ability to absorb a lot of low-skilled labor, which these countries have abundantly of, and just telling these countries that just they need to move up the value chain is good, but it's actually it's telling them something that is not going to be very helpful given their factor endowments. And so what that does is essentially hits developing countries with a kind of what I've called it a triple whammy, which is that one is that there is a significant decline in their comparative advantage in manufacturing as manufacturing becomes less low skill, labor intensive. Second, for any level of industrialization, precisely because of this lower labor intensity of manufacturing, less labor is being absorbed into manufacturing. And third, because manufacturing is now increasingly more and more complementary to capital and skills, the buoyancy of manufacturing, that is its ability to respond to positive profitability shocks, is much lower, so that manufacturing is not the kind of dynamic sector over time as it has been typically. Now, so we can see sort of what is happening in sort of within manufacturing. If you look at across countries and divide up sort of the share of labor of low skill, intermediate skill, and high skill labor in global manufacturing, what's really striking is that all of the decline in the labor content of manufacturing globally over time has taken place in the low skill category. And that's, of course, important because that's the category in which the developing countries have comparative advantage in. You see a very similar kind of a picture if you look at global value chains, specifically the use of different types of labor within global value chains. And global value chains are important because that's the mechanism through which technology is transmitted towards developing countries. So participating in these global value chains means that you have to use those technologies that they require. And you can see, again, very clearly a decline in the use of low educated workers within those global value chains. So what is happening is that basically this traditional model of development, this traditional structural change model that we had, which was that we would start out by all the economy's labor in these informal agricultural traditional sectors. Then the process of industrialization moved them into the formal organized manufacturing and then ultimately into the tertiary sectors. What is really happening today is something that's very, very different. It's not that workers are not leaving agriculture, they're still coming into urban areas. But effectively, they're coming into informal petty services within the within the urban areas, and the formal parts of manufacturing are becoming really, really very, very thin layers of the economy, almost sort of analogous to the kinds of mining or resource enclaves in these countries. So just a couple of examples of what it used to look like. So these are two East and Southeast Asian examples of the traditional model of industrialization, where most of the growth in employment took place in the context of formal employment. But if you look at today in African cases like Ethiopia or Tanzania, what you're seeing is that most of the growth, even when there is growth in employment, such as in Ethiopia, as I said, it's been actually not insignificant. Most of the employment is actually happening in the informal parts. So the basic story here is that the firms that can successfully compete in global markets, successfully integrate with global value chains, are those that have to adopt these skill and capital intensive technologies, which participation in those global value chains requires because of having to meet their their quality requirements and so forth. But those are precisely the ones that are the least suited in terms of employment absorption. And therefore, you have this dichotomous development within these countries where the most productive parts, those that are doing well in terms of productivity and exports, are actually not growing employment-wise. They're not absorbing any employment whatsoever, whereas to the extent that manufacturing as a whole is growing, all of the increased labor is going into the least productive and the least productively dynamic parts. So that's that dualization of manufacturing itself. So the conundrum, and I think this is sort of where we move into questions about policy, is the conundrum. The question is, where will labor go? There's a lot of possibilities in agriculture, in non-traditional agriculture, but it's hard to see that agriculture will turn itself into a labor-absorbing part of the economy. While we need to improve productivity in agriculture, that's not where labor is going to go. Services, well, I think services are, of course, are a big mix of different kinds of things. The most productive services that are also tradable and share some of the technologically dynamic aspects that manufacturing historically has are also fairly skill intensive. So I think here, for example, the developing countries face the additional disadvantage that even though, as David mentioned, that many of these new technologies are creating new types of job classifications in services, most of them are actually non-traded. And so they're not going to be necessarily linked up, I think Kaushik's optimism notwithstanding, with workers in the developing world. It's very difficult to envisage informal sector workers or farmers being absorbed in these internationally tradable services. And that's, at least, there's been very little of that. So I think to close up with, there's really, three strategies that are available, and this really exhausts all the possibilities as a logical matter. One is, of course, the traditional remedy of simply increasing the skill level of the labor force, invest in education. Well, that is always the remedy for the future, but doesn't solve the problem in the short run or the medium run. So that has to be complemented with other measures. Second, we can reduce the skill intensity of existing production within developing countries. But this is really, very difficult in light of existing technological realities. And so many of these production techniques are set globally, and the kind of, sort of flexibility to adjust the factory intensity or the production technique in response to relative factor prices is relatively limited. And I think so the third possibility is, and I think this is the one that really, to me, seems to be the only one that affords or provides a way where we can have a significant impact, is to stimulate the production of the more labor-intensive sectors. And I think this would require a fundamentally different strategy from the traditional export or industrialization-oriented strategies, because if that's not where the jobs are going to come from, then we're going to have to focus on the relatively non-tradable parts, the small-scale SMEs, and this would require a kind of a strategy for helping firms that are not necessarily the most productive, but the ones that are sort of in the middle of the productivity spectrum, mostly services and SMEs. So it's really going to require an industrial policy that looks very, very different. But if we don't engage in this strategy, I just don't see how we're going to be able to create jobs, particularly in low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are facing still significant amount of young job seekers who are in the urban areas and that need to be employed more productively than they currently are. So with that, let me just stop here.
Thank you very much, Danny, for this incisive analysis of the new dynamics facing developing economies and global economic convergence and technology's role in that. So now Laura has the easy task of being the discussant of all of this work, and to do so in 10 minutes. Thank you, Laura, for valiantly taking on this challenge. Over to you. Laura, you need to unmute yourself.
I said, thank you. I said, these are terrific papers, and I encourage everyone listening to read them carefully. They're very well researched. They're very well written, and they're great, and a very important topic. I will just comment on a few things, mainly things that the authors didn't say that I found interesting. And then I'm going to relate it a little bit to some work I've been doing particularly on AI and the uncertain future of AI. So for David's paper, first of all, David, implicit in his paper, but never laid out, and I think important for all of this discussion, is that technological change has a displacement effect, has a productivity effect, and has a reinstatement effect. And I don't think that, I'm pretty sure that David does not think we're entering a world where humans become dinosaurs. I think we're going to have full employment. I think depending upon aggregate demand policies, we're going to have full employment. And the composition of employment is going to look different. It's going to change over time. Workers are going to be displaced from certain jobs and certain tasks. They're going to see their productivity enhanced in certain jobs and certain tasks, and they're going to be entirely new jobs and tasks. And I think that's important. But I also think it's important to note that for the political issues that we are behind the scenes dealing with, the pace of those things does not occur. It does not occur at the same pace. So the disruption or displacement usually occurs pretty fast and pretty dramatically, and maybe localized in certain places. So if we take this notion of David's work on the China shock with linked technology that made the whole supply chain world possible, that shock was very focused in certain communities. The displacement was real and dramatic, and those workers didn't find other jobs. There were not productivity enhancing opportunities for them, and there were not reinstatement effects for the reinstatement possibilities for them. David mentions, and I really want to emphasize that in his continuing work on polarization, which shows up in all of the developed countries very clearly, a decline in the share of middle skill and middle wage jobs, a increase in the share of lower skill, lower wage jobs, but a much bigger increase in the higher wage, higher skill jobs. So we've got to think about reskilling. Upskilling exists, and reskilling to get those workers who are displaced from the middle to go up, not down. What one of his charts shows very disturbingly, and I think this was Dara Nasumogo's chart, is we have a world in which the reinstatement into higher skill jobs is occurring at a much slower pace than the disruption that's occurring. So technological change is actually driving people from the middle to the bottom more than with the opportunities to reinstate at the top just occurring at a slower pace. I think those are really important points in David's analysis. Related to that, all of the work on inequality and technological change is really about inequality, not about what happens to the bottom. Why are the bottom wages falling? Why isn't the productivity and the technology raising wages for everybody, but the gap is getting bigger, okay? And I think there you have a lot of policy issues to address. There are a lot of things that the advanced industrial countries can do to try to prop up wages at the bottom, and I'll get to that in a minute. The final point I'll make on David's paper is AI, because I have got out on a limb perhaps and characterized AI as what I call routine-based technological change on steroids. And the reason I say that is because the AI makes the robots more intelligent. So there's going to be more robot taking over of human jobs. And AI also substitutes more and more for cognitive skills. So it's more, as David points out, we already see displacement occurring in relatively high wage, relatively high skill, routine cognitive jobs. So if I take that this is going to be routine bias technological change on steroids, I'm afraid I predict the same consequences of previous rounds of automation. I predict that there will be wage inequality. I predict that there will be a decline in labor share of national income. I predict that there will be a continued gap between productivity growth and labor compensation growth. And I therefore I'm cautiously pessimistic about AI and future effects on labor markets. And I know the effects are uncertain. I agree with David on that. But I do think the characterization of robotic technological change, routine bias technological change on steroids is a good characterization. All right, so let me go on to Kaushik a minute, because there's a natural link here. Kaushik really focuses on how the technologies, on essentially who owns the technologies, on, okay, the technologies themselves are going to have these effects, but where are the profits going to go? Who owns the profits? Who owns the robots? Who owns the platforms? So while I don't agree with him on it's a dinosaur moment for humans, I think that automation does substitute for certain kinds of labor with a lag, and in different places, it reinstates labor. So I don't think we're like horses and we're going to be undone by technology. However, I do think that, and this is relevant to Danny's paper, that how the technologies are deployed is being driven increasingly by super firms, super large firms, platforms. So the super firm, super normal profits issue, which is not really addressed in David's paper, I think is important to highlight. Because, for example, if you look at the productivity effects of technology, what you see is the firms at the frontier, the large digital giants in STEM and in platforms, their productivity is doing just fine. So they are actually growing productively, and they are also paying higher wages to their workers. So you do have inter-firm wage inequality, and increasingly important role in overall wage inequality. And then you have the supernormal profits that Kaushik was talking about. So I do think there are a whole host of policy implications for that we can discuss. As he mentioned, traditional competition policy is not going to work here. These firms have power because of economies of scale and network effects, and those are beneficial. So how are we going to deal with the things we don't like if we want the economies of scale and network effects? Competition policy won't work. He mentions profit sharing. I'm a big proponent of profit sharing. I was a Marty Weissman student at MIT. I went into economics partly because I was interested in profit sharing. I studied Yugoslavia, which was at the time the preeminent profit sharing model in the world, and considered to be a socialist model that was successful. I do not, organized labor around the world doesn't like profit sharing, and regulators don't like profit sharing. So I'm afraid I don't really see that as a possibility. I think that Jean Tirole has written many, many interesting papers on how if you're worried about a platform, or you're worried about privacy, for example, on Google, or you're worried about interoperability between Google and Facebook, you got to regulate those things directly. You can't break them up. You got to regulate the things directly. I think that's very important. One other point that Kaushik makes, and is I think made in all the papers, is tax incentives. So he talks about who owns the robots, but let's talk instead about who owns the profits of the robots. And we have a global system right now. There's a possibility we might get a global tax agreement. I hope we do, because a lot of these big companies we're talking about at the frontier of technology, earning supernormal profits, are stateless right now from the point of view of where they pay taxes. They're paying no taxes. They're paying no taxes. And we're close, I think, to a tax agreement on this. I think that's much more likely than the global social contract that Kasich talks about in his paper. I don't see any move in that direction, but possibly a global agreement on taxes. And as all the papers recognize, the incentives for automation right now, think about it. We're talking about automation. All the decisions about automation are being driven by business investment decisions. And what do they look at? They look at taxes and they look at labor costs. Those are the things they look at. Those are the two things that a CFO has. They're the biggest claim on revenues, labor and taxes. So right now we have a system which taxes labor relative to capital. It makes the return on capital less subject to tax and the cost of labor higher because of tax. So taxation is an important policy issue. Let me end with a few comments on Danny's paper. Yes, I agree completely on premature industrialization. However, I will say to both you and to Kasich and to the group, the industrialization revolution, what the world experienced after from the Industrial Revolution today is not sustainable in the future. We have used up Earth's climate to do that. It's not possible. It's not possible. So we need to think about development strategies which take into account the cost to our environment of continuing to industrialize. It's not sustainable. So it may be that it's premature, but it's not sustainable to industrialize. That model that the advanced industrial countries use and that China used, not possible anymore, it seems to me. Danny didn't mention, and I find his use of this really important and helpful to the audience to see. He has a very important matrix where he talks about thinking about policies at the pre-production phase. That would be like education, training, and things like that. The production phase, like what do we do to help small and medium-sized enterprises get to the technological frontier? And the post-production phase, which is essentially redistribution. Okay, at the end of the day, we may have to redistribute some income. It's a very good matrix, and it helps me think about the policy recommendations in all the papers. This is where I'm going to end. One is everybody agrees on the importance of education and training, but different kinds of education and training. For the advanced industrial countries, I have done a lot of work on Germany. The apprenticeship system has been a big help. But on the other hand, I'm going to pose this, I guess, for David. One of the things that's happened in Germany is as the middle income jobs in manufacturing have reduced, people have gone into services, but there's a lot of licensing requirements and services. There's a lot of training. To be a hairdresser in Germany is to have a income level and a training level, which is a living wage level. It's a professional level. So economists don't like licensing, but on the other hand, apprenticeships and licensing may be a pretty good thing. I want to mention workers' voice and unions, just because in the advanced industrial countries, certainly the erosion of union power, particularly in a country like the United States, where these effects, the negative effects on labor have been most dramatic, the erosion of union power is very, very important. Again, Germany kind of shows in many ways the importance of collective bargaining. Let me just say support for small and medium-sized enterprises. Again, my work on Germany, the strength of Germany, one of the strengths is the Mittelstand, the medium and small enterprises. They're very connected to their communities. They're also more financed by debt than equity. That means those two things together mean they have a much longer term perspective. And if they are going to reduce their labor in some uses in the firm, they actually look for ways to maintain the overall labor force, perhaps over time reducing employment, but certainly not in the kind of dramatic, disruptive way that would occur in the United States. And then I'm just going to end with the importance of demand policy. There are many other policies to talk about, but
Yes,
demand policy.
Laura,
Yeah. Okay.
just
So,
a couple minutes.
okay, just the
Yeah, thank you.
composition. Just David's already made this point, but let's think about it for a minute. The demographics and healthcare in the advanced industrial countries. That is where a lot of jobs are going to occur. And then the question for policy is going to be, what are the benefits around the jobs? What are the labor protections around the jobs? Are there minimum wages around the jobs? There's a whole host of policies in the development of the service sector. So why don't I stop there? Great papers. It was hard to summarize. There's so many things.
You did very well, Laura. Thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. So we have, we'll go over a few minutes. If you would please stay with us. We have, let's say, about 20 minutes for some follow-up questions. I would also work into those some questions that we have received from our viewers. And please keep your answers to 2 to 3 minutes most per question, so we can get 3 or 4 or 5 questions in the time that we have left. Let me go back to David. I mean, Laura also touched on AI. I mean, this is a key question of interest to many, including some of our viewers, how AI, which is the sort of next phase of the digital revolution, will affect labor market dynamics. David, you touch on this in your paper and presentation, and you note the great uncertainty associated with how AI capabilities and applications may evolve in the future. The question, Laura touched on that also, that many have is this. I mean, could AI accentuate the trends of increasing job polarization and wage inequality that we have seen with the advance of digital technologies in recent decades, and compound public policy challenges in promoting good job creation for all and mitigating rising inequality? Could you say a few more words on that, David?
Sure. So I mean, let me again underscore the uncertainty. I think as I wrote in my paper, it's a lot easier to say at this point what AI can do than what it can't do or won't be able to do. And so this, kind of creates a lot of, the confidence intervals on everything are expanding, meaning we're becoming less confident. Laura characterized the effect of AI as kind of routine, displacing technological change on steroids. But I think what's sort of built into that is the definition of what's routine is expanding, right? So we used to think like driving a car was not a routine task because it required all this, kind of context awareness and sightedness, and now it's done by AI. So many things that we used to not think of as following well understood rules and procedures will now be accomplished by software. You can call that routine, but it would be a lot of decision-making tasks, a lot of managerial and judgment tasks. And those were things where we used to think you needed kind of a lot of, many inputs and a kind of a fuzzy decision rule. So it wasn't good for computers. But of course, as I stress, people aren't that good at that either. So computers don't have to be that great to displace people. So yeah, I think it has the potential to hollow out the middle more. I don't think it's going to eliminate the highest professions. I don't think it's going to eliminate the least skilled jobs, but I think it could lead to more hollowing out, more polarization. But it could also, in fact, it could actually reduce the value of a college degree. If a lot of college educated workers are middle managers, right, they may succumb to the same middle skill displacing process that, administrative workers and production workers have seen. So I think there's a lot of things that could happen, but I think we should also think constructively about how do we use it to augment people rather than just what might it take away, right? So for example, Laura talked a lot about moving people from the middle to the top. I think that's great. I think we want to improve the quality of jobs for people who don't have college degrees, just like Germany does, as Laura emphasized, and as Danny's famous matrix also emphasizes, there's a way to improve job quality. And so, We got to be thinking, how do we augment, non-college workers if they're doing repair? Can we give them things like Google Glass to give them information, make them more effective? Can we augment, medical service workers who are not doctors to do more care and do it more efficiently? So this is, my admonition that we should not ask what AI will do, but what we want it to do. I think, I'll end on that. I think it's really valuable for us to take that constructive point of view. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, David. That's a good segue to next question to Danny. Danny, in your paper, you say that we need to revive the idea of appropriate technology, and that government should take a more active role in steering innovation in a more labor-friendly and development-friendly direction. Some, including some of our viewers, asked the question whether there are risks associated with governments picking winners and whether a heavier hand of government in the innovation regime may not muzzle innovation. Now, governments, of course, have an important role here, unquestionably. But I think it would be helpful if you would say a bit more on the sorts of tools governments may use to shape innovation in the desired direction. Danny?
Yeah, actually, this points. This links very directly with the last point that David made, and actually reiterated from his own presentation, that just the broadening from AI to technology more generally, that we don't. Our standard narrative is that we should our labor markets and our skills and our society should adjust to technology, and I think this is this is weird. Technology should adjust to society, at least meet it halfway. It's and it's remarkable how we just take for granted that there is just this train that's moving along in its own speed and its own direction, and then when we talk about redirecting technological change or moving AI in a direction that's going to be more directly useful for society and for labor markets, then people say, but can the government pick winners? But the government is already in this up to its neck, as Laura mentioned. I think there are everything about our tax policies is already incentivizing firms to invest in automation. And then there are, I think, other reasons why the decisions that innovators and firms make are not necessarily in line with the social valuation and costs of different technologies, and so we've understood that there are a lot of areas where public policy ought to play a role in directing technology. For the longest time, obviously, the public sector has been an investor in military technologies and defense technologies. We take it for granted that there is a role for the public sector to direct technology in the direction of military or military-related technologies. Now it's perfectly, taken for granted that given the climate challenge, that we should invest in green technologies, that we should have the right kinds of incentives there. Why not also broaden the agenda to thinking about how we can envisage directing technology in a more labor-friendly direction as well? And I think we do have the institutional frameworks for that. Everything from DARPA-style agencies with take on these tough challenges of how do you think about this problem, to our small-scale industrial technology extension programs, everything from the Small Business Administration to local economic development initiatives and so forth, that are intimately linked with what's happening with this. And again, Laura knows well, in countries like Germany or in many other places, actually in Europe, because labor is much more directly involved in the governance of firms, that the type of technologies that are adopted, the consequences for firms, play out very differently when you change the nature of the decision makers, or where you give labor a voice, for example, in the adaptation. Now, all of that is fine, but again, from the standpoint of the hat that I was wearing in this panel, which is what to do for developing countries, here is yet another reason why developing countries are at a disadvantage, because all the decision makers in this domain are going to be in the advanced countries, whether it's the innovators or the public sectors of the advanced countries, and nobody's really looking out for the interests of developing countries here. There are some large middle-income countries, the Brazils of this world, the Indias of this world, that have some innovation programs where they could actually make this an appropriate technologies for their purposes a much more central objective. And they do that in areas of climate change and sustainability. But again, it's another areas of the labor markets is something that I think they neglect and they could get more into.
Thank you, Danny. We have time for one more question, and I would ask Laura. I mean, you briefly touched on some of the points that Kaushik has made. He mentioned one important area where new thinking and policy innovation is needed is antitrust and competition policy as technology reshapes markets, in particular the regulation of tech giants and digital platforms that have emerged as gatekeepers in the digital economy and exhibit features of natural or quasi-natural monopolies. We know that the current chair of the Federal Trade Commission, Lina Khan, also has been arguing that the US antitrust framework may be ill-equipped to address the competition policy challenges of the digital era. And some of our viewers also are asking whether competition policy and institutional framework needs a major overhaul. And there was this related question of a point that Kaushik makes, that if machines, about broadening the ownership of capital, that if machines replace workers and wages become profits, part of this can flow back to workers if they own a share of capital and associated profit. So if there are ways to broaden ownership of capital, that can be considered. I mean, there's a lot in there which needs further thought and fresh thinking. But you touched on that, and any additional thoughts that you may wish to offer on those points, Laura?
Well, I won't speak for Kaushik. I do know that in general, the economics profession has been moving in this direction for quite some time, to the view that the technological giants have too much market power. They have market power vis-a-vis the consumer. They have market power vis-a-vis businesses, because, for example, if you list your business on an Amazon platform, over time, Amazon can adjust your contract to take more of a profit share. They can actually develop a competitor for you. So the Volrasian auctioneer actually becomes a producer of things that they also allowed other small firms to list on. So there are, I would say, real issues in terms of these firms. Kaushik focused a lot on the platform companies. But the market power of these firms vis-a-vis businesses, it's not the customer, it's not the price point, it's vis-a-vis businesses, and also monopsony power vis-a-vis labor. I think that's the other one that's really important here. You're beginning to see in the United States, and I think it will move forward, but slowly, efforts to unionize at Amazon, just as an example. The firm it may be right now the biggest employer in the United States. In many parts of the country, it certainly is the biggest employer. That added exercises tremendous monopsony power. So I think that is very important. I'm not an antitrust lawyer, and so I cannot determine whether there are ways to adjust the antitrust law itself. As I said, I tend to think at the end of the day, the solution is not going to be breaking these firms up because of the network externalities, because they're large, because there are benefits of economies of scale and networks. On the other hand, we can insist, for example, or public policy could insist, that there be more interoperability, so that actually you have, if you're working on one platform, you have the ability to also work on another platform. That seems to me to be completely sensible. So again, I would go back to the notion of what Jean Tirole has been saying, was there are lots of things that we can do to regulate these giants, but let's think about exactly what we want to regulate and then write the regulation for that behavior. And if the issue is they're just earning supernormal profits, then actually that becomes a taxation issue. That becomes, as I said, these are stateless corporations right now in terms of where they pay taxes. We can get at some of their supernormal profits by taxing them.
Thank you, Laura. So, I mean, this has been a very stimulating, thought-provoking discussion. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time. So I would like to thank our speakers for their excellent presentations and comments. They've given us important insights and ideas to reflect on. I would also like to thank all those who joined us online and shared their questions and comments. Just a couple of brief remarks at the end. One, the cross-cutting theme of our discussion today and of the report underpinning it is that we are living at a time of significant change. Technology is changing markets, business models, and the nature of work in major ways. It is altering growth, employment, and distributional dynamics. These shifts pose new challenges for public policy to harness technological change to build greater and more inclusive prosperity. And it is clear from our discussion today that we are at a juncture where we need fresh thinking and innovations in many areas of public policy, several of which our speakers touched on today. And one other comment, if I may, and that is that political discourse on public policy to reduce inequality often focuses narrowly on redistribution, that is taxes, transfers. That is indeed an important element. But as the presentations and our discussion reveal, there is a big and crucial agenda of pre-distribution to make the growth process itself more inclusive by improving opportunities for and capabilities of smaller firms and less skilled workers as technology transforms product and labor markets. This includes, of course, competition policy, worker training, active labor market policies, and more. And in a similar vein, Danny, in his paper, underscores reform of policies that pertain to the production stage of the economy. At Brookings, we have a continuing program of research on how technology is reshaping economies and public policy agendas. And we look forward to more discussions of the kind that we had today. We will be posting a recording of this discussion on our website, and it will also be available on YouTube. So with that, thank you all again. We close this event. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.